walked away, arm in arm, with Miss Knag in the middle, in a special state of amiability. 'I've taken such a fancy to your daughter, Mrs. Nickleby, you can't think,' said Miss Knag, after she had proceeded a little distance in dignified silence. 'I am delighted to hear it,' said Mrs. Nickleby, 'though it is nothing new to me that even strangers should like Kate.' 'Hum!' cried Miss Knag. 'You will like her better when you know how good she is,' said Mrs. Nickleby. 'It is a great blessing to me in my misfortunes to have a child who knows neither pride nor vanity, and whose bringing up might very well have excused a little of both at first. You don't know what it is to lose a husband, Miss Knag.' As Miss Knag had never yet known what it was to gain one, it followed very nearly as a matter of course that she didn't know what it was to lose one. So she said in some haste, 'No, indeed I don't,' and said it with an air intending to signify that she should like to catch herself marrying anybody. No, no, she knew better than that. 'Kate has improved even in this little time, I have no doubt,' said Mrs. Nickleby, glancing proudly at her daughter. 'Oh, of course,' said Miss Knag. 'And will improve still more,' added Mrs. Nickleby. 'That she will, I'll be bound,' replied Miss Knag, squeezing Kate's arm in her own to point the joke. 'She always was clever,' said poor Mrs. Nickleby, brightening up, 'always, from a baby. I recollect when she was only 2 years and a half old, that a gentleman who used to visit very much at our house, Mr. Watkins, you know, Kate, my dear, that your poor papa went bail for, who afterwards ran away to the United States, and sent us a pair of snowshoes, with such an affectionate letter that it made your poor dear father cry for a week. You remember the letter, in which he said that he was very sorry he couldn't repay the £50 just then, because his capital was all out at interest, and he was very busy making his fortune, but that he didn't forget you were his goddaughter, and he should take it very unkind if we didn't buy you a silver coral, and put it down to his old account. Dear me, yes, my dear, how stupid you are! And spoke so affectionately of the old port wine that he used to drink a bottle and a half of every time he came. You must remember, Kate.' 'Yes, yes, mama. What of him?' 'Why, that Mr. Watkins, my dear,' said Mrs. Nickleby slowly, as if she were making a tremendous effort to recollect something of paramount importance, 'that Mr. Watkins, he wasn't any relation, Miss Knag will understand, to the Watkins who kept the old boar in the village. By the bye, I don't remember whether it was the old boar or the George the Third, but it was one of the two, I know, and it's much the same. That Mr. Watkins said, that when you were only 2 years and a half old, that you were one of the most astonishing children he ever saw. He did indeed, Miss Knag, and he wasn't at all fond of children, and couldn't have had the slightest motive for doing it. I know it was he who said so, because I recollect, as well as if it was only yesterday, his borrowing £20 of her poor dear papa the very moment afterwards.' Having quoted this extraordinary and most disinterested testimony to her daughter's excellence, Mrs. Nickleby stopped to breathe, and Miss Knag, finding that the discourse was turning upon family greatness, lost no time in striking in with a small reminiscence on her own account. 'Don't talk of lending money, Mrs. Nickleby,' said Miss Knag, 'or you'll drive me crazy, perfectly crazy. My mama was the most lovely and beautiful creature, with the most striking and exquisite the most exquisite nose that ever was put upon a human face, I do believe, Mrs. Nickleby.' Here Miss Knag rubbed her own nose sympathetically. 'The most delightful and accomplished woman, perhaps, that ever was seen, but she had that one failing of lending money, and carried it to such an extent that she lent thousands of pounds, all our little fortunes, and what's more, Mrs. Nickleby, I don't think if we were to live till the very end of time, that we should ever get them back again. I don't indeed.' After concluding this effort of invention without being interrupted, Miss Knag fell into many more recollections, no less interesting than true, the full tide of which Mrs. Nickleby, in vain attempting to stem, at length sailed smoothly down by adding an undercurrent of her own recollections; and so both ladies went on talking together in perfect contentment, the only difference between them being, that whereas Miss Knag addressed herself to Kate, and talked very loud, Mrs. Nickleby kept on in one unbroken monotonous flow, perfectly satisfied to be talking, and caring very little whether anybody listened or not. In this manner they walked on very amicably, until they arrived at Miss Knag's brother's, who was an ornamental stationer and small circulating library keeper in a by-street off Tottenham Court Road, and who let out by the day, week, month, or year, the newest old novels, whereof the titles were displayed in pen and ink characters on a sheet of pasteboard swinging at his door-post. As Miss Knag happened at the moment to be in the middle of an account of her 22nd offer from a gentleman of large property, she insisted upon their all going in to supper together, and in they went. "Don't go away, Mortimer," said Miss Knag as they entered the shop. "It's only one of our young ladies and her mother, Mrs. and Miss Nickleby." "Oh, indeed," said Mr. Mortimer Knag. "Ah!" Having given utterance to these ejaculations with a very profound and thoughtful air, Mr. Knag slowly snuffed 2 kitchen candles on the counter, and 2 more in the window, and then snuffed himself from a box in his waistcoat pocket. There was something very impressive in the ghostly air with which all this was done, and as Mr. Knag was a tall lank gentleman of solemn features, wearing spectacles, and garnished with much less hair than a gentleman bordering on 40 or thereabouts usually boasts, Mrs. Nickleby whispered her daughter that she thought he must be literary. "Past 10, said Mr. Knag, consulting his watch. "Thomas, close the warehouse." Thomas was a boy nearly half as tall as a shutter, and the warehouse was a shop about the size of 3 hackney coaches. "Ah!" said Mr. Knag once more, heaving a deep sigh as he restored to its parent shelf the book he had been reading. "Well, yes, I believe supper is ready, sister." With another sigh, Mr. Knag took up the kitchen candles from the counter, and preceded the ladies with mournful steps to a back parlour, where a charwoman, employed in the absence of the sick servant, and remunerated with certain 18 pences to be deducted from her wages due, was putting the supper out. "Mrs. Blockson," said Miss Knag reproachfully, "how very often have I begged you not to come into the room with your bonnet on?" "I can't help it, Miss Knag," said the charwoman, bridling up on the shortest notice. "There's been a deal of cleaning to do in this house, and if you don't like it, I must trouble you to look out for somebody else, for it don't hardly pay me, and that's the truth, if I was to be hung this minute." "I don't want any remarks, if you please," said Miss Knag, with a strong emphasis on the personal pronoun. "Is there any fire downstairs for some hot water presently?" "No, there is not indeed, Miss Knag," replied the substitute, "and so I won't tell you no stories about it." "Then why isn't there?" said Miss Knag. "Because there aren't no coals left out, and if I could make coals I would, but as I can't I won't, and so I make bold to tell you, mem," replied Mrs. Blockson. "Will you hold your tongue, female?" said Mr. Mortimer Knag, plunging violently into this dialogue. "By your leave, Mr. Knag," retorted the charwoman, turning sharp round, "I'm only too glad not to speak in this house, excepting when and where I'm spoke to, sir, and with regard to being a female, sir, I should wish to know what you considered yourself." "A miserable wretch!" exclaimed Mr. Knag, striking his forehead. "A miserable wretch!" "I'm very glad to find that you don't call yourself out of your name, sir," said Mrs. Blockson, "and as I had 2 twin children the day before yesterday was only 7 weeks, and my little Charley fell down an airy and put his elbow out last Monday, I shall take it as a favour if you'll send 9 shillings for 1 week's work to my house afore the clock strikes 10 tomorrow." With these parting words, the good woman quitted the room with great ease of manner, leaving the door wide open. Mr. Knag at the same moment flung himself into the warehouse and groaned aloud. "What is the matter with that gentleman, pray?" inquired Mrs. Nickleby, greatly disturbed by the sound. "Is he ill?" inquired Kate, really alarmed. "Hush!" replied Miss Knag. "A most melancholy history. He was once most devotedly attached to Madame Mantalini." "Bless me!" exclaimed Mrs. Nickleby. "Yes," continued Miss Knag, "and received great encouragement too, and confidently hoped to marry her. He has a most romantic heart, Mrs. Nickleby, as indeed all our family have, and the disappointment was a dreadful blow. He's a wonderfully accomplished man, most extraordinarily accomplished. Reads every novel that comes out. I mean every novel that has any fashion in it, of course. The fact is that he did find so much in the books he read applicable to his own misfortunes, and did find himself in every respect so much like the heroes, because of course he's conscious of his own superiority, as we all are, and very naturally, that he took to scorning everything and became a genius, and I'm quite sure that he is, at this very present moment, writing another book." Another book!